And so we're really delighted that Charlie has joined us tonight. So as well as being a trustee at the Museum of British Surfing, Charlie is a surfer, a jewellery maker and collector of vintage surfboards and memorabilia, and has an impressive collection of 115 of his own boards in his personal collection. So Charlie, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Nicola. Good evening, everybody, from a very cold North Devon. So, as Nicola said, I'm Charlie Spurr. I'm one of the trustees of the Museum of British Surfing here in Broughton. And we're going to be talking about the history of surfing in North Devon and its influence on British surfing industry throughout the years. So, the history of surfing in North Devon, it could actually fill many, many hours of discussion. But tonight I'm going to try to condense it all down into about 45 minutes. So you'll have to accept my apologies if I miss out any key events or your favorite surfer or your favorite part of the history. It's not intentional. This history is really my perception of the history as well. So you'll hear some of my favorite surfers I'll be talking about and favorite events during surf history this evening. So before we look at the history in North Devon, we really need to consider the origins of surfing and how it arrived on the British shores. So if we go all the way back to 1778, Captain Cook, who was a fellow Yorkshireman of mine, arrived in Hawaii on his third voyage of discovery. It was there on HMS Discovery and HMS Resolution, and he encountered the sport of surfing for the first time. Then in 1779, members of his crew actually jumped overboard into the sea and actually tried surfing as well. So they joined the locals to actually have a go. So this is probably the earliest account so far of Westerners having a go at this ancient pastime. Sadly, as people probably know, Captain Cook was killed later on in 1779. By some Hawaiian islanders, and this is possibly the first incident of localism in surfing that we know about. Maybe they didn't want Captain Cook to share, the rest of the world about their secret spots. Captain Cook's journals were then completed by Lieutenant James King, and as you can see on this picture, if you look at right at the bottom, kind of towards the left, you can actually see an image of a guy paddling a surfboard. So this was the first evidence as well, or pictorial evidence of people actually using surfboards. So while surfing in Hawaii was a common sport, it was actually unheard of in Britain until 1890. Before that, very few people entered the sea for the purpose of surfing. It was just purely for leisure. North Devon was traditionally an area of fishing and farming, but this stretch of coastline had been popular with tourists as a tourist destination since Victorian times. So it attracted visitors from across the country and abroad, primarily because of the perceived health-giving properties of sea bathing. So, the first record of surfing in England was in 1890 when two Hawaiian princes and their English tutor went surfing on the northeast coast of England in the resort of Bridlington. So we know this because there was a letter recently discovered in the archives of the Bishop Museum in Honolulu, which described how these two princes, so Prince David Kawakanoka and his brother Prince Jonah Kahoa, and their English guardian, a guy called John Wrightson, actually went surfing in September in 1890. apparently what happened is that they'd been doing their studies, and as a reward for their good work, they were allowed to go to the coast. They asked a local boat builder to shape a couple of boards, don some woolen swimsuits, and they paddled out into the North Sea. You can imagine what the Victorian locals must have thought about this, first of all, seeing two Hawaiian princes, and then also going out surfing in the waves, which was completely and utterly unknown at the time. John Wrightson actually as well was recorded to have actually tried surfing as well. So it's possible that he was the first British person to try surfing actually within the UK. So 2 years later, this young lady here, she also made history. So this is the cousin of the two Hawaiian princes. This is an expert surfer called Princess Victoria Kailana, and she was half Hawaiian and half Scottish, and she was the heir to the Hawaiian throne. She was educated in Britain, in Brighton, down on the south coast, and that was in 1892. So we think that she may have been the first female surfer in Britain. She wrote a letter back home talking about her enjoying being on the water again, which we believe is actually an indication that she was actually going out surfing. I mean, she was a very high-spirited girl, and history shows that she was actually a very, very talented surfer. And when she returned to Hawaii, she used to like to sneak out on a night to go night surfing with her friends. Sadly, her life was short and tragic. Ill health and sorrow laid her to rest in 1899 at the tender age of just 23. And this was shortly after Hawaii was annexed to the United States. I mean, some people say that she probably died of a broken heart due to the annexation. So knowledge of surfing then became more widespread at the beginning of the 20th century. So Jack London, a famous author and explorer, wrote The Voyage of the Snark in 1907, with extracts appearing in British magazines and newspapers describing surfing as the joys of the surf rider. So many newspapers, including the Illustrated London News, featured pictures of surfing in around 1910. The article spoke of the surfer being ready to stand upon his board while it is in full forward motion, not such a difficult feat at all. So yeah, illustrations like this will have been inspiring people in the UK to consider the whole sport of surfing. What we find, though, is that the history of surfing before the First World War is very sparse in the UK, though we do have evidence of it being practiced elsewhere in Europe in as early as 1906. This hand-drawn postcard, which I actually discovered a couple of years ago on eBay of all places, is a very, very early record of surfing, and it was posted in Italy at a place called Forte de Marmi in Tuscany in July 1906, and it's actually in German. It was written in German, and it was quite difficult to translate because it was actually in Old German, but thankfully I got some German friends who managed to be able to translate this. And it does describe these people on holiday and actually going surf riding, as they called it. And as you can see from the illustrations that they'd done, these are fairly representative of belly boards and even the type of belly boards that people still use today. So we believe it's quite possible that because people in Europe were starting to go surfing and belly boarding, that kind of practice could have actually spread to the UK shores as well. So we do actually, as I said, we do believe that some people were riding waves in Britain in the early 1900s. There's a cartoon in Punch magazine from July 1914 that implied surfing. And it implied that it was actually taking place in Britain. And there's evidence from a number of literary references to suggest that people were surfing here before the First World War. But it seems it didn't become very popular as a beach activity until after the First World War, so in about 1919. And we understand that soldiers returning from the war took to the waves in the West Country and in the Channel Islands and all along the South Coast, influenced by their Commonwealth comrades. So, you know, during the war, that a lot of British soldiers were actually, you know, meeting up with Australian and South Africans and people from the USA, where we know that surf riding was actually being taking place. So they could have been inspired to actually try the sport when they got back. This photograph, so the photograph on the left, it's quite a famous photograph, and that is Hobart Braddock. And he's actually pictured at Westwood Ho Beach. And we think this was in about 1919 that this was taken. And it's the earliest photo of evidence of surf riding in North Devon. The character on the right-hand side, so who famously replicated this photograph, is Robert Braddick. And this is Hobart Braddock's grandson, who actually owns quite a lot of the holiday parks and pubs and stuff in Westwood Ho, and he famously replicated this photograph, and you can see it in the Pier House in Westwood Ho. We also believe there's some anecdotal evidence that surfing took place in North Devon, perhaps as early as 1904, but it's not known yet how widespread surfing or surf riding was at the time. And one of the things that we'd love to hear at the museum is if anybody has got grandparents or great grandparents who have got photographs or old stories of them surfing before the First World War, we'd be really interested to hear about it. So during the after the First World War, the surfing that we were doing in the UK was basically lying down on belly boards. But our British royal family, or some of our British royal family, were actually learning to surf standing up. I mean, the author Jack London called surfing a royal sport in his essay, Learning Hawaiian Surfing. And in this description, it is probably true because both King and Queens actually surfed in Hawaii. So it follows that one of the Britain's earliest surfers was a member of our own royal family. So Edward Albert, who was then the Prince of Wales, who eventually went on to become King Edward, who abdicated famously, he learned to surf in Hawaii during a royal visit in April 1920. And by all accounts at the time, he actually loved it. And he was taught by the father of surfing, or who is respected as the father of surfing, the famous Duke Kahanamoku. The prince then returned to Hawaii later in the year, and he actually surfed with the Duke's brother called David. And we've got photographs in the Museum of British Surfing showing him, and these are the photographs showing him surfing along with Louis Mountbatten. I mean, his exploits were well reported in the newspapers back here in the UK. So this is the Times of London reporting it. And they were revealing how he reveled in the new sport and enjoying the exhilarating rides. And we think that because this was very widely reported, that it probably inspired others to try the sport. So in the museum, we actually have got an exact replica of the surfboard that Prince Edward rode. And it's actually hand shaped from 100-year-old Hawaiian koa wood, and it was done by a guy called Greg Hall of Petroglyph Surfboards for us, and it was done as a tribute to Prince Edward surfing. Sadly, we can't get hold of the original, which is actually in the Surf Museum in Honolulu, but this is the closest that we've got to it, and we're very proud to actually own that in the museum. I mean, during the 1920s, there was other celebrities of the day that actually caught the surfing bug. The fine lady with the knees on the left-hand side there is the famous author Agatha Christie. So after the First World War, Agatha and her husband Archie left for a world tour to promote the upcoming British Empire exhibition. And their first stop was in South Africa at Muinsburg, where they actually took up belly boarding. They continued their travels over to Honolulu, arriving in August 1922. And then they actually started to begin riding surfboards standing up. They were taught by the locals how to surf properly. And by all records, they really enjoyed it and got quite proficient at it while they were there. These surfboards were huge. I mean, they're kind of 10-foot long, weighing about 100 pounds. So they used to get some of the locals to push them into the waves. But after 2 or 3 months of actually surfing, both Agatha and Archie were getting quite good at surfing, and both of them were recorded to actually being able to stand up on surfboards and ride back into the shore. Agatha was actually living in South Devon at the time as well, but sadly, we don't know whether she actually continued surfing here when she got back from Hawaii. And one of the things that we're going to be doing at the museum is working with the Christie archives, so the Agatha Christie archives, to try to look through those records to see if there's any record of her actually surfing in Britain at all. So far, we haven't found anything. So we move on now to 1929. So while English people were experiencing surfing abroad, there was no real records of stand-up surfing in Britain until 1929, when this character, Louis Rosenberg from London, made himself a surfboard. Apparently he'd seen a movie tone reel of surfing in Hawaii, thought that's a good idea. So he built himself a surfboard and actually filmed himself surfing. And he even built a very rudimentary waterproof camera to fit onto his surfboard. And we've got this film actually in the museum archive. And it's really interesting seeing him actually down there in Newquay surfing. Sadly, we don't know what happened to the surfboard. Apparently it got stolen somewhere in London, probably just turned into firewood, which is a bit of a shame. But if you ever come to the museum, you can actually see extracts of this film. We've got it playing in the museum. So surf riding was starting to become very popular, and a very popular pastime in both Cornwall and North Devon. Here you've got a group of surf riders down in Cornwall, actually. And we think that this photograph was taken sometime in the 1920s. And you can see the boards are actually just basically very primitive wooden boards just nailed together. They were actually modified coffin lids. They're about 5 foot long, and they were actually made by a local undertaker down in Perranporth. And we know that this practice of building this type of surfboard spread to North Devon at that time. So here we've got a family picture from Sawton taken in 1929. And as you can see, people are starting to use better shaped belly boards, but on the right-hand side, there's another kind of coffin lid kind of shaped board. This family picture, the family who actually provided this picture to us and donated it to the museum, their descendants are still surfing here in Sawton. So that's 5 generations on, or 6 generations, I think it is, are still surfing. So they certainly got the bug. So, as we said, some of these early belly boards were kind of homemade from any piece of wood or commissioned from local carpenters. They were given that nickname of coffin lids because of the virtue of their shape. And the fact is that they were actually made by a lot of local coffin makers. We've found some letters, and one of them written in 1928, and I'm going to quote from it. And this is the quote. It says, "Some old friends returned to Broughton from either Malta or Gibraltar and found to their horror that there was no surfing at Sawton or Croy Bay. So full of good ideas, we children cycled to the local undertakers and borrowed coffin lids." And then there's another letter that we've discovered, and we think this was in about 1927. And it was a lady from Tunbridge Wells who was on holiday in Croyd with a mother and sister. And she said in her letters, and again I quote, "Who should turn up but a couple of cousins from Australia who took one look at the breakers in the sea and were amazed to see no surfing. Without any loss of time, they went to see the local village carpenter and supervised the making of 2 wooden boards and took us all down to learn how to surf." So we see there's evidence of people really, starting to get involved in surfing. The thing I love about that photograph as well is their dressing gowns. So probably these is a good idea where Dry Robe got their design ideas from. We also see a lot of evidence from surfing in the 1920s and 1930s from the postcards that were produced at the time. And this one was produced in 1931, and it shows the headland at Sawton. And as you can see on the postcard, people with belly boards surfing or surf riding. And this was actually, if you look, this was actually published before, in the days before Sawton Sands Hotel was actually built, which was actually built in 1933. And the one thing that's really striking on that photograph as well is how empty the headland is. If you look at it, if you stand in that same place and take a photograph today, it looks one hell of a lot different. So evidence of surfing then began to appear more and more in publications. This character, Ernest Lee Bennett, wrote a book called Devon and Cornish Days in 1932. And he observed surfers at Coomsgate in Woolacombe. And again, a lovely quote from it. And when he says that all very well for these Hawaiians, or whatever they call themselves, to imagine they hold the field of surf batiks. They don't. You should see some of our fellas and the girls, they're marvelous. So then move forward to 1934, and the first ever guide to surf riding in Britain was published. And this was really being sold to the growing band of people who were enjoying this kind of, and again, a quote, refreshing sport. It was written by a guy called Ronald Funnell, and it was a full-on surf book. This was the first real guide to surfing, and it tells readers how to ride waves, obviously just lying down, and where the best surfing beaches in Britain were. There was also adverts in a 1934 tourist guide that state that you get a free copy of this book when you bought a Crest surf riding belly board, which was one of the first commercially produced boards. This book was quite an interesting one, actually, and this is the only known copy of it that we've actually found in Britain. It was reprinted in 1953, but this is the actual original 1934 version, and it's the only one in existence that we know of. So during the 30s, more and more people were starting to explore the ideas of stand-up surfing. And in about 1937, there was an ice cream seller called Pip Staffiera who saw a photograph in the 1929 Encyclopedia Britannica of surfing in Hawaii, and he thought he'd like to have a go. So with no plans, no idea how to surf, he actually built this 13-foot hollow wooden board. And after a bit of experimentation with the design, he even added a fin to it. So he would spend his summer evenings surfing alone at Great Western Beach down in Newquay after he'd finished selling ice creams to the tourists. The board apparently was so heavy that he had to wheel it down to the water's edge on a modified baby's pram. But thankfully, we managed to get some. No, there were photographs of him actually surfing. This was no doubt with people starting to travel in the 1930s. If people saw him, they'd have started to get inspired to actually try surfing themselves. So in 1938, so November 1938, the Holidays with Pay Act actually came into force, which enabled about 9 million workers earning up to £250 per year to take a holiday. Although holiday making habit took some time to become embedded within the British culture. But the trend for beach holidays grew, and increasingly more visitors would travel from cities, coming by train to Barnstaple, Broughton, Motorhoe and Ilfracombe. So this is back in the day when the railways actually ran down here, on the famous Atlantic Coast Express. And they came down to enjoy this new fun and healthy activity. And a lot of guidebooks started to be produced to North Devon, and a lot of them showed bellyboarding on their covers. So this had really started to highlight the popularity of the sport. And when you think about it, North Devon provided easy access for holidaymakers from places like Exeter, Bristol, London, and beyond that. And as a result, developed a strong and unique place in the history of surfing in Britain. I mean, some people also were lucky to own a car. This photograph was taken just before the First World War, about 1939, we believe. And imagine a trip down to North Devon by road must have been quite an epic back then. But it shows that people, again, if you look in the background, people enjoying surfing on Croyd Beach. And this was just before the onset of the war. Second World War didn't really put a stop to things. I mean, we saw that there was a lot of extra people coming down to North Devon. So there was evacuees and servicemen, in particular in preparation for D-Day. And the beaches became training grounds populated by troops. And in addition to the British soldiers, there was many others came from America and some from Australia who saw the potential provided by the excellent surf beaches here in North Devon. And bellyboarding continued to be a popular pastime. In this illustrated news magazine was, I think, from about 1943, and featured, people bellyboarding. So, it continued to be popular throughout the actual war as a pastime. So after the Second World War, 2-week seaside holidays became incredibly popular, and huge numbers of people arriving by train every summer weekend in North Devon. This character, Bert Yayo, from Woolacombe, he had many business interests, including owning plenty of local garages. he also had a coach business where he took visitors on day trips all around the southwest. When the drivers weren't on the road, Bert kept them busy making belly boards in a large garage building at his coach parking yard in Motorhoe. In winter, this was their main employment, and making up to 50 boards a day. So this was a huge local industry. His business grew and grew with the popularity of beach holidays. And in the 1960s, Bert's young nephew, Malcolm, started working there in the school holidays. And he sent us some really nice quotes over the last few years. And one of them is, and this is Malcolm talking. He says that one of my jobs was to order the 8-foot by 4-foot sheets of marine ply. We took a delivery of 500 sheets two or three times a year. When helping to unload them by hand, then carrying them and stack them was tough for a schoolboy. And when you think about it, with 8 boards coming out of each sheet of plywood, they were producing about 10,000 belly boards a year, which is a huge number. And we think that this was really the genesis of surfboard manufacturing in North Devon. One of the other relatives talks about Uncle Bert selling masses of boards to Vince's, the wholesalers in Ilfracombe, who sold them to clients all over the country. And with direct sales in the southwest, transport wasn't really a problem because Bert's coaches were going all over the place. So any sandy beach had a potential site for selling and renting out boards. So they used to just take them on the coaches and then sell them to other distribution points all around the country. They also had a very thriving hire business with these boards as well. So you could hire one for a 10 bob. So in new money, that's 50 pence deposit. And they used to cost a shilling a day, so 5p to hire. And one of the things they were saying that is if it didn't get returned, it didn't really matter because actually the deposit pretty well covered the full manufacturing costs of the boards. So you can imagine a lot of these boards actually never ever got returned. They probably got taken home with them. I mean, thing is, by the 1980s, though, Bert's business started to decline. A lot of visitors had their own cars, railway had long gone, and coaches weren't needed. So Bert actually sold the old coach premises in Motorhoe, and he moved down to Woolacombe and down onto the site, which is now the Gulfstream Surfboard Factory, where apparently he made 7,000 windbreaks over the next few years. So still carried on with his business, looking after the holidaymakers. We believe, if you do the calculation, that Bert's factory probably made about 300,000 plywood boards during its lifetime. And it's probably the biggest and longest running belly board enterprise ever. So let's jump forward to the early 60s, so about 1961, when a guy called Doug McDonnell bought what is believed to be the first ever fiberglass and foam surfboard over to the UK. It was a Malibu longboard shaped by Bill Bragg in California, and it was actually glassed by McDonnell himself. Doug had moved to California from Liverpool in the mid-1950s and started surfing in 1957 on a balsa longboard just outside San Francisco. When he returned to Britain, he embarked on what was probably the first true safari in the country. He surfed in Scarborough up on the northeast coast, and then drove down through Devon, surfing on many of the Devon surfing beaches, and finally ended up in Newquay in Cornwall with this surfboard safely strapped to the roof of an old Bedford van. This board is actually now in the museum collection, so we're quite proud to own what is probably the first fiberglass surfboard ever surfed in Britain. We understand, and this was from a great friend of the museum's, Barry Charlesworth, who I think some people who live in Broughton will know, that the earliest account of stand-up surfing in North Devon dates from about 1957, when an unknown Australian rode waves off Coombsgate. But it wasn't until about 7 years later that waves were ridden on a regular basis, when the local guy, Alan Kift, who some people will know, who was a volunteer lifeguard, actually purchased a fiberglass board from Cornwall. The board was a friendly bear board shaped by a guy called Bob Head, and he began riding it in Woolacombe. And a few years ago, we had the pleasure of hosting some of these surf pioneers at the museum. On this photograph, on the left is Paul Latham. You've got then Pete Sandy and Alan Kift on the right. And they've got with them some of the original boards. So the center is the Friendly Bear board, and then it's flanked on either side by two Bob Powers boards. Here's just another lineup of some of the legends that visited the museum that day. So again, Alan Kift on the left, and then Tony Cope, very famous American surfer and shaper, Bing Copeland in the middle. Then Al Brooks, who's still around in Broughton, and Bob Powers on the end there. The original Beach Boys, these guys. So the sport of stand-up surfing was starting to grow in the 1960s, and a guy called Percy Blanford enabled hundreds of British surfers to ride their first waves on his hollow wooden surfboards. Percy was a naval architect and known and respected worldwide for his home-built boat and canoeing designs. And in 1964, he hit on the idea of creating a cheap hollow wooden surfboard that surfers could make for themselves at home. So in May 1965, his plans and instructions were published in the Boys' Own paper under the headlines of "Make your own super surfboard for £4." And if you think at the time, a custom shaped surfboard like the ones that Alan Kift had surfed on, cost about £30. So this was a very, very cheap and affordable way to get into surfing. And that surfboard, the original prototype surfboard, is actually in the museum at the moment. So if you ever visit, you can actually see that. So commercial surfboard manufacture really started in North Devon with Bob Powers. Bob was one of the first board shapers in North Devon, and originally a cabinet maker by trade. He produced boards for a few years in the mid-1960s, so between 1964 and 1967, after he'd seen Malibu surfing when he was on holiday down in Newquay in 1962. He met Bob Head, who was then shaping the Friendly Bear surfboards, took some mental notes on board building, went back to the Midlands and built his own board. In 1964, he and his family relocated to Motorho, and he started making boards and supplying them to the small but dedicated North Devon crew. One of the trademarks of his boards was the one-piece stringer and fin, which really showed his woodworking skills. These boards were covered in a coloured gel coat rather than the usual resin finish, and really high quality, well-made boards. Sadly, there was a kind of still a limited market for surfboards. So he actually stopped the business in 1967 and went back to cabinet making. But he did leave a strong legacy supplying boards to the pioneers of surfing in North Devon. We think he only made about 80 boards, and only a fraction are actually survived today. And you can see, again, you can see one of his early boards on display in the museum. But this was the point when the North Devon surf industry really started to take off. There's a character called Clinton Fitzgerald from Woolacombe, and he started shaping boards. So he took over Bob Power's business after Bob had given up, and started making them under the Surfboards Inc. label through about 1967 and 1968. And then in 1969, he changed the name to West Coast Surfboards. These boards were also sold in department stores. So you can see the one on the left there, which has got Gales on it, and which was a sports shop in Bideford and Barnstaple. So these were, we're starting to sell surfboards through kind of department stores. Another character, Roger Linden, turned up from New Zealand. He was a beach lifeguard in Woolacombe in 1969. And he used to help Fitz out by sanding the boards, and he learnt to glass and shape a few during that season, and carried on making them in the same premises, which was in South Street, after Fitz emigrated to South Africa in 1970. So at the time, he used up the remaining West Coast logos and then started his own brand, which was called Celtic Surfboards. So meanwhile, in 1969, full-blown surfing began to take off, and when Broughton acquired its very own surf shop, when Tim Hayland and Dave Aldrich Smith moved down from Abergavenny and set up Tiki down in South Street in Broughton. I mean, demand for surfing was growing in North Devon, and in 1968, they had already built 110 Tiki boards to supply North Devon and South Wales, and their business blossomed. They grew quickly, and they opened their manufacturing centre down at Velator Quay in about 1971. So in Broughton, board factories were starting, and surf shops started to spring up everywhere, and a strong local surfing community was born. In the late 70s, there were at least 11 board factories in operation, and boards were exported all over the UK. They were exported down to France and the wider surfing world. And at the time, shapers from Australia, the States, South Africa, would visit the UK on a regular basis. And they'd bring lots of ideas about new board designs and shapes. So it ensured that our locally made boards were actually still at the forefront of the world designs. So with more and more surfers arriving from all over the world, they all started turning up and surfing on the beaches in North Devon in the 1970s. They brought that knowledge and expertise with them, many of them being shapers who designed and made their own boards. And they stayed here in North Devon. Some made North Devon their home for quite a while. And Broughton became a massive centre of surfboard manufacture. And here we've got some of the more notable ones. Bruce Palmer, he's a real legend of shaping and board riding in the UK. In the early 70s, he actually worked in Hawaii, shaping alongside Jerry Lopez and Dick Brewer, who were integral in transforming board designs at the time. And he came over to the UK and became an active member of the Croyd Surf Lifesaving Club. In the mid-70s, in 1975, he won the title of British Surf Champion. And he and other Australian surfers, such as John Hall and Kevin Cross, were living and surfing in the southwest of England, and were important in British surf industry history for influence and evolving board shaping. Here's Kevin Cross, and alongside the chairman of the Museum of British Surfing as well, Kevin Cook. They're a very young looking Kevin Cook there on the right hand side. He turned up in Woolacombe in about 1969, along with another Australian, John Hall, looking for work as beach lifeguards, but all those jobs were taken up. So they just found some local premises themselves, which actually was the old laundromat in South Street in Broughton. And in 1970 started making surfboards under the Kijo So Kevin and John, so the KE and the JO surfboards. Kevin then went solo, so he made the famous Cream Honey brand, Silver Wings, and then his own named brands, Kevin Cross Surfboards, before eventually returning to Australia. John Hall, who came along with Kevin Cross, he was born in Sydney. He came across when he was in his early 20s. And as I said, he set up business originally with Kevin. And he made boards all through the 1970s. I mean, primarily he worked for Tiki. He was a real board making machine was John Hall. There's stories of him being able to churn out 8 surfboards a day and then go surfing in the evening. But he also worked for people like Graham Nile, Conway, New Wave, Circle One, Chapter, and also worked with Creamed Honey with Kevin Cross before eventually moving back to Australia. And if you see John Hall's surfboards, you can see the quality of his craftsmanship. They're really nice boards to look at and also to ride. I mean, the British surf industry was really starting to grow now. And being located in North Devon allowed good access to the urban markets. So Phil J. Surfboards, who was originally in Barnstaple, the success of it actually encouraged him to open an outlet in London. And the J Surf Shop was opened in Wandsworth, and that became the first dedicated surf shop in the capital. And this was obviously just really starting to jump on the bandwagon of London surfers coming down to North Devon to go surfing. I mean, there was many notable shapers around at the time, and I think there's one that deserves a very special mention is Paul Blackie Blacker. He's been making boards for over 50 years now, and he's still shaping boards today. He actually shaped one for me last year, which was a really nice event to go and spend some time with him while he actually shaped the board. And he actually carries the iconic Lightning Bolt title, and he's held that since 1982. And Lightning Bolts are a very famous Hawaiian brand and very protective of who actually makes their boards. His factory is up in Knoll, just outside Broughton, where he's actually been producing boards up there for about the last 35 years. He's still 100% makes the boards himself. He does every stage of the manufacture, right from shaping right through to glassing and finishing. So he's a true one-man artisan surfboard maker and a real character as well. So Chapter Surfboards enjoys real considerable success in the 70s. It was founded by a guy called Merv Beard, who had previously worked at Tiki. And you find in the history of surfing that a lot of people started their careers working at Tiki Surfboards and then moved on to do their own thing. In 76, he and a colleague, a guy called John Flipper Stacey, developed a new system of manufacturing molded boards. So this allowed the design to be replicated over and over again. These boards are commonly known as pop-outs. So they were made actually in a mold. And they enabled them to produce about 25 boards a week. And they moved to a bigger premises up in Knoll. And then in the mid-1980s, Mervyn joined forces with another ex-Tiki employee, Al Brooks, and they opened a surf shop in Broughton, so Chapter Surfboards in Broughton. And this is when surfing was really starting to gather momentum during the 1980s. So Chapter were quite innovative, so not just on the manufacturing front, they also had some fresh ideas about marketing. And in 1980, a few years before professional surfing really took off in Britain, Merv Beard rounded up several of the best local surfers and actually sponsored them to promote the brand. These included people like Richard Carter, Tim Barrow, who's there pictured here, Pete Oram and Mike Baker. And within a year or two, most of the other main British surf companies had copied this formula and sponsored surfers themselves. So with the beaches such as Croyd and Saunton and Putsborough, North Devon was an ideal area to hold competitions and for these pro surfers to hone their skills. So along with making surfboards, we also needed wetsuits. And North Devon is home to the highly successful wetsuit brand of Second Skin, which was started by Andy Shollick. And Second Skin is still here in Broughton in North Devon. Again, Andy originally worked for Tiki, and he actually encouraged Tiki to start making wetsuits themselves. He was very innovative and he came up with loads of ideas for wetsuits, and one of them was to use different thicknesses of neoprene to make them more comfortable to wear. He left Tiki and he set up his own business and brought in many new ideas in wetsuit design and was actually an industry leader for many years. And as I said, he still continues today here in Broughton. So by the 1980s, Croyd and most of North Devon was firmly placed on the surfing map. Croyd was really known as North Devon's answer to Fitzgerald Beach down in Cornwall and is recognised as a world-class surfing spot. So, you know, the low tide Croyd is really famous, kicks up some really nice A-frame waves. And, you know, there's other areas like the Point, you've got Oysters, the Cave, Putsborough, Coomsgate, really good surfing areas, producing some really, really nice world-class waves. Being only about 3 hours drive from London and very accessible, North Devon became a very popular place as a surfing holiday and weekend destination. It was a bit of a double-edged sword, though, as we know that house prices got inflated and lineups in the surf lineups actually became more and more crowded. But on the other hand, there were opportunities and jobs with the ever-increasing number of surf shops, board companies, campsites, accommodation related to surfing. In '82, Rick Abbott published this guide to surf spots of North Devon. And again, this actually drew in more and more people to experience and enjoy surfing up here. So if you look at, as you can see, North Devon has been the epicenter of British surfing industry right since the 1960s. In the late 70s, there were at least 11 board factories in operation, and their boards exported all over the UK and around the wider surfing world. Many brands, shapers, shops, they've been and gone. There's some long established ones still surviving, new ones starting to grow and get established in the area, and continuing through the tradition of the homegrown British surfing industry. We haven't really counted how many surf shops and businesses there have been. Maybe one day we need to sit down and do that. It's good to see, though, that North Devon surfboard manufacturing still continues today in the traditional way as well. So we're not mass producing boards. We've got artisan board shapers. So people like Jules Matthews, who makes Gulfstream surfboards. He established his factory in Woolacombe in 1993 and is an award-winning shaper, very, very talented surfboard shaper. And there's many other small surfboard shapers starting to build a reputation for quality boards in North Devon. There's people like Josh Hughes at Electrofish Surfboards in Westward Ho, who is starting to produce some really nice traditional boards. think one special mention should really go to this lady, Ellie Miller. She built Miller surfboards from the ground up and has established and shaped a significant presence in the male-dominated shaping world. She's a really well-respected shaper by her peers. She makes real high-quality boards, which are ideal for British waves. And long may British surfboard manufacture continue. North Devon also became the administrative centre of British surfing. A guy called Stewart Matthews was the national coach for the British Surfing Association and recognised that English competitive surfers were not getting the full support that they deserved. So he helped to set up the English Surfing Federation, and it was launched in Broughton in 1979 with the help of Eddie Russell, Andy Shollick, Bob Groves, and Pete McCallum. In the 1980s, the English Surfing Federation nurtured several North Devon surfing talents who went on to make an impact on British surfing. For example, the people like Esther Spears, Pete Oram, Richard Carter, and Neil Clifton all made an impact on both the national and the world surfing championships. And then at the end of 2016, the English Surf Federation merged with Surfing Great Britain, and that enabled Surfing England to achieve the national governing body status. And surfing continues to grow. Nowadays, surf culture remains very vibrant in North Devon. Obviously, we've got the Museum of British Surfing there in Broughton. We've got Surfing England, who actually are on the same premises as at the museum. And also, when you look around the area, I think we've got 6 surf and surf life-saving clubs based on 4 of the main beaches. And there's been a massive increase in the diverse nature of surfing. We've got the Wave Waheens, who are promoting women in surfing. We've got the Wave Project, which is based locally, working with disadvantaged people. Most of the local surf schools have got surf clubs. We've got adaptive surfing taking off, and many national and international competitions are being held in North Devon, as well as the Atlantic Water Sports Games. So surfing is very strong in this area. I mean, the area continues to nurture plenty of homegrown talent on the world stage, and this is especially important with the growth of the sport and the inclusion in the 2021 Olympics. That's assuming that it does go ahead. Surfing is going to be an Olympic sport for the first time. But, you know, from North Devon, we've got people like Andrew Cotton, the famous big wave surfer. You've got Taz Knight, Linden Wake, Ashley Broughton, Lucy Campbell, Peony Knight, just to name a few. All extremely talented surfers, all nurtured here in North Devon. So why North Devon? I mean, the coast is blessed with a huge variety of surf breaks, which respond to different swells and wind directions. We've got an outstanding coastline with beaches, and they provide some of the best surfing conditions in Britain. We get strong westerly Atlantic swells here. So when they arrive at Sawton, Croyd, Putsborough, Woolacombe, Westwood O, Lynmouth, which is in the north of the county, which is an amazing left-hand point break. So no matter what the weather is, whichever way the swell's coming from, we've always got some surfable beaches. And we believe, the last statistics I saw, that we actually, on average, we've got 307 surfable days a year in North Devon. So it's a very, very consistent area to be able to surf in. There's also, in the background over the last few years, there's been a multi-institutional team has been working to get North Devon designated as a World Surfing Reserve. And this is going to ensure the environmental, leisure, economic and cultural protection for generations to come. But sadly, the global COVID pandemic has kind of stalled the application process, but work continues to achieve a national designation, which could become a model for protecting other wave breaks and surf communities across the whole of the UK. So hopefully over the next few weeks or few months, we should be getting some more news about whether or not we actually finally get this national designation, which will be a real asset to North Devon as a community. And when you think that surfing is an important economic contribution to North Devon, and it's estimated that it's worth about £50 million annually, and is set to grow, and especially with COVID going on, I think more and more people will be taking holidays in the UK. So I think we're going to see surfing become more and more popular in North Devon, and North Devon becoming a very popular holiday resort, or even more popular than what it currently is. So, and then finally, a little bit about us here at the museum. We're a registered charity run entirely by a group of, a very small group of dedicated volunteers and trustees. We give up our own time for no financial reward whatsoever. We've just got a passion to preserve and display our rich heritage and culture of British surfing. We've worked hard on the museum. We received full accreditation from the Arts Council in 2019, which was a superb achievement for us as a small independent museum. And even during this time of lockdown, we've been working hard to ensure that the museum survives, and we've got some exciting new projects coming up over this next few months, which you'll be seeing on some of our social media feeds. Whether we open or not, we're going to go ahead with some of those projects. And we've not only got the museum, we've also got a huge archive to go with it. And we've got a small shop in the museum, and we sell a lot of things online as well. So you can check us out on social media. Our current exhibition is running, if we get a chance to reopen, which is how the past shaped our present. So we're really looking at how the shapers of the past are influencing today's culture, as a little bit of what we've talked about tonight. And so come and see us, and you'll learn much more about our rich history and culture of British surfing. Oh, and by the way, if anybody wants to volunteer at the museum, please get in touch. We're always looking for volunteers. So that's it. Thank you for listening. I'm hoping that everyone's still awake. Not too many people dropped out. I'll just say to everybody, stay safe, everybody out there, stay stoked, and we hope to see you at the museum soon.
Thank you so much for that, Charlie. That was absolutely fascinating talk. Can I ask you to stop sharing your screen, if that's okay? And
yeah, sure.
We'll see if anyone wants to ask some questions.
Let me just can't find my mouse. It's okay. There we go.
Lovely. Excellent. I'll just go to my grid view. Right. Has anyone got a question that they'd like to ask Charlie? If you'd like to use the raise hand icon, which you can find on the 3 dots on the more button, or if you want to ask something in the chat, you stun them all into silence. You're over 2 screens at the moment, or if you want, you can wave at me, physically wave at me, and I'll try and see if anyone's got a question. I think
we've stunned everybody into silence, so I hope I didn't bore everybody to death too much on some of those.
There was a comment in the chat, actually. There was somebody, let me just have a look. There was someone who was the fifth generation of one of the surfer family that you mentioned. And someone saw their great grandma from 1929. Oh, right, yeah. That's amazing. Just checking.
Yeah, we were very appreciative of those photographs actually, because it gave us a real insight into surfing, you know, during the 1930s. And we love those old photographs. I mean, we always say if anyone's got any old photos, and especially the stories behind them, we'd love to see them. Yeah, I think I was just looking back in my notes. There's Ernest Gladstone was on there. Effie Gripper, who is the great grandmother of the lady who sent us the photos. And there was a daughter, Joyce, who was holding the big surfboard.
Oh, Paul's got a question. Hang on, I'll try and find you, Paul. Do you want to unmute yourself? I can't find you on the screen. Paul, did you have a question?
Hi, it's Ro here.
Oh, sorry. Hi, Ro.
I'm very good at Zoom. Yeah, it's my great grandmother was Effie.
Oh, fantastic.
Gladstones are various relatives and cousins as well. So me and my daughter and my grandsons are about the sixth generation of surfers, I think, and locally.
Wow, fantastic. Thanks for joining us tonight.
One of the things that we'd want to do, we've said that we'd love to do, is actually recreate that photograph down on Salton Beach.
I don't have
with the new generation of the family. That would be absolutely fantastic to do.
We might try it sometime. Yeah,
we should. I mean, post lockdown, we should do it. We've got plenty of old boards, and in fact, we've got a coffin lid board in the museum collection, a proper coffin lid, so we can take that down to the beach as well.
And Rose's daughter's written in the chat as well. She'd be up for that photo. That sounds like a fantastic idea. And then David Chittock has written that his family were behind Windjammer in Braunton. So he's got lots of photos of the factory shop. So he can probably send some photos as well. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, again, we'd love to see those. I mean, it's like, even if we can just get scans of the photographs for our archive, because, you know, trying to piece together this jigsaw, which is British surfing culture, it's like eating an elephant at the moment. You know, it's one small piece at a time, really. But I mean, the whole of the museum collection has been generously donated over the years, which is fantastic. I mean, even during the lockdown, there was a lady in Norfolk sent us a belly board and photographs of a father who used to surf during the 1960s, which was very, very kind and generous of them. And again, that's then going to be preserved for future generations.
It's fantastic, all the work that you're doing there. And I was really interested as well to hear about the nature of the surf reserve. Yeah. Because that sounds like, as well as it takes in, you know, the whole kind of impact of surfing and, you know, the sort of the impact that it's had on the history and culture of North Devon. So what sort of things will that involve then?
I mean, it's everything from environmental protection, so it'll give us leverage as well with some of the environmental agencies, because we still know that, you know, there's far too many spillages of, you know, kind of sewage outflows on some of the prime beaches as well. So it gives us leverage that side. It also obviously puts us on the world surfing map as well, and it's going to help us in so many ways, and from a tourist point of view as well. I mean, some people might not like it in a way, because obviously it encourages more people to come to North Devon, but it's great for the economy for the long term.
Yeah, it sounds like it'll be good for the environment and the economy of North Devon.
Exactly, yeah.
That's brilliant. Oh, David's got a question. David, do you want to unmute yourself?
Sorry. Yeah.
There you go.
I came to the museum when it was because you were in Brighton originally, weren't you?
Yeah, it was. I mean, the
in the
project.
Arches.
Yeah, the project was started by Pete Robinson.
Yes,
and he started it down in Brighton, and then he took it as a touring exhibition. And then eventually we found a permanent home here in Broughton in North Devon for it.
Yeah, because it was just in the Arches, wasn't it, in Brighton?
It was, yes.
It was a bit tight down there. Is he still involved in it, Pete Robinson?
No, he's not. Pete's moved on to other things now. He moved on about 5 years ago.
Okay.
So, so we're continuing his legacy, really. And we've got a new set of trustees that run the museum and taking it on to the next phase. But Pete did an outstanding job just getting it off the ground.
Yeah.
And a lot of the collection was actually, was donated by Pete. It was his own personal collection of memorabilia and surfboards, which he'd collected over, dozens of years. So a very generous thing to do, to donate that.
Yeah, he made a fantastic contribution to setting up the museum in Broughton, which is obviously the great place for it to be. Has anyone else got a question? Or I'll just check over. You're over several screens on my screen, unfortunately. I don't know how I've managed to make it do that, but it's just the grid view. So if no one else has got a question, then we'll draw the evening to an end. So thank you very much for joining us this evening, and also for your contribution to both the Museum of British Surfing and to the Countryside Centre. So just to let you know, our talk next week is with geologist Ken Rutherford. So he'll be talking about why the geology of North Devon has made it so special. So we're looking forward to that next week. So I hope you can join us for that. And then finally, a big thank you to Charlie for his excellent talk this evening, which has been absolutely fascinating. So if you could all join me in a virtual round of applause or thumbs up. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope to see you in the museum sometime.
Yes.